For a long time, life in this city looked normal. Markets were open, children played in the streets, and people still believed tomorrow would come. But beneath the noise of everyday life, something was breaking. Food was becoming harder to find. Walls were closing in, and escape was no longer an option. This wasn't a sudden disaster. It was a slow death. Ordinary people didn't wake up one day knowing their city was doomed. They adapted, they hoped, and they stayed, even as collapse became inevitable. This is the story of what daily life looked like inside a dying city, when survival meant choosing between fear, hunger, and impossible decisions. The city was Leningrad, and the year was 1941. In the summer of that year, Leningrad stood as one of the great cultural capitals of Europe. Nearly 3 million people called it home. The Hermitage Museum housed masterpieces that rivaled any collection in the world. The Kirov Ballet performed to packed audiences. Universities hummed with intellectual debate. Factories produced machinery that powered the Soviet industrial engine. The city had survived revolution, civil war, and political upheaval. Its people had endured hardship before. They believed they could endure anything. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, the news arrived in Leningrad like a distant storm. People gathered around public loudspeakers to hear official announcements. Many expected a quick resolution. The Soviet military was vast. Surely the enemy would be repelled. But within weeks, German forces advanced with terrifying speed. By late summer, the Wehrmacht and its Finnish allies had pushed to within striking distance of the city. The streets that had buzzed with summer activity now filled with anxiety. Families began to discuss what they would do if the worst came to pass. Some made plans to evacuate. Others refused to believe the danger was real. On September 8, 1941, German forces captured the town of Schlüsselburg on the southern shore of Lake Ladoga. With this single action, the last land route out of Leningrad was severed. The city of nearly 3 million souls was now completely surrounded. The siege had begun, though most people inside did not yet understand what this would mean for their lives. At first, the people of Leningrad did not fully grasp the magnitude of what had happened to them. The city was encircled, yes, but the government assured them that the situation was temporary. Supplies would get through. The military would break the blockade. Life continued with an uneasy normalcy. Shops remained open. Trams still ran along their familiar routes. People went to work in offices and factories. Children attended school and played in courtyards. The rhythms of daily existence masked the terrifying reality that the city had become a sealed container, slowly running out of everything it needed to sustain human life. The German strategy was calculated and deliberate. Rather than storm the city and suffer massive casualties in brutal street-by-street combat, the Wehrmacht chose to starve Leningrad into submission. Artillery bombardment and aerial attacks would destroy infrastructure, industry, and civilian morale. Hunger would accomplish what bullets and shells could not. In the cold calculation of German military planners, the population of Leningrad was not meant to survive the coming winter. The city was to be erased from existence, its people left to perish behind the encircling lines. Inside the blockade, Soviet authorities faced an impossible arithmetic that grew more desperate with each passing day. The city had food reserves sufficient for perhaps a month of normal consumption. Nearly 3 million mouths needed feeding every single day. There was no way to bring in adequate supplies by any means available. The only route that remained partially open was across Lake Ladoga to the east, and in the early weeks of the siege, it could not carry nearly enough to make a meaningful difference. Rationing began almost immediately, but the rations themselves told a grim story of what was to come. Bread allotments dropped week by week as supplies dwindled. By November, a factory worker received 250 grams of bread per day. Office workers and dependents received just 125 grams. Children received the same meager portion as office workers. This was not enough to sustain life over any extended period. The bread water pipes froze solid and burst, flooding apartments before the water itself turned to ice. Electricity became intermittent in October, then vanished from most residential buildings entirely by December. People burned furniture, books, floorboards, and anything else that would catch fire, just to stay warm enough to survive another night. Apartments became tombs of ice where frost formed on interior walls. Families huddled together under every blanket and piece of clothing they owned, sharing body heat, and still the cold found them. Hunger transformed everything about daily existence. The human body, deprived of sufficient nutrition, begins to consume itself in a desperate attempt to survive. Muscle tissue wastes away. Fat reserves disappear. The mind becomes foggy, sluggish, obsessed with thoughts of food to the exclusion of almost everything else. Simple tasks become exhausting ordeals. Walking a short distance requires rest. Climbing a single flight of stairs becomes an achievement requiring enormous effort. People moved through the frozen streets like ghosts, wrapped in layers of clothing, their faces hollow and their eyes dull with hunger and exhaustion. Death was everywhere, impossible to ignore. Bodies lay in doorways, on sidewalks, slumped against buildings, in apartments where entire families had perished together. There were not enough living people with enough strength remaining to eyes dull with hunger and exhaustion. Death was everywhere, impossible to ignore. Bodies lay in doorways, on sidewalks, slumped against buildings, in apartments where entire families had perished together. There were not enough living people with enough strength remaining to bury the dead. Yet within this catastrophe, the ordinary mechanisms of human life persisted in ways that seem almost impossible to believe from a distance of decades. People continued to report to work. Factories that still had electricity kept producing vital war materials. The Kirov Works, one of the largest industrial plants in the city, manufactured tanks, artillery pieces, and ammunition throughout the entire siege. Workers who could barely stand from weakness operated heavy machinery through sheer force of will. They fainted at their stations from exhaustion and hunger and, when they could summon the strength, got up and continued working. The choice was not really a choice at all. Working meant receiving a slightly larger bread ration that might mean the difference between life and death. Stopping work meant death came faster and more certainly. The city's cultural institutions refused to die alongside its people. The Hermitage had evacuated much of its collection before the blockade closed completely, but dedicated staff members remained behind to protect what could not be moved. They lived in the basement of the museum through the winter, guarding empty frames and carefully cataloging what remained. Scholars continued their research by candlelight, pursuing knowledge even as their bodies weakened. Poets wrote verses about what they witnessed, creating a literary record of suffering that would survive the siege. Musicians rehearsed in freezing concert halls, their breath visible in the frigid air as they played. In August 1942, the Leningrad Radio Orchestra performed Dmitri Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony, a monumental work the composer had begun during the siege itself before being evacuated. The performance was broadcast throughout the city and transmitted beyond the blockade lines. Loudspeakers were set up to ensure that German forces could hear the music as well. It was an act of cultural defiance, a declaration that the people of Leningrad had not surrendered their humanity or their spirit, despite everything that had been done to break them. Children somehow continued to learn even as the siege tightened its grip. Schools remained open whenever possible, though attendance was sporadic and teachers struggled to stay alive themselves. Students sat in freezing classrooms wearing coats, hats, and mittens, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air as they recited lessons. They studied mathematics, literature, history, and science, while hunger gnawed constantly at their bodies. Some schools converted into hospitals or shelters as the crisis deepened. Others closed entirely when there was no fuel whatsoever to heat them. But wherever a teacher could gather students together, education continued in some form. It was a form of resistance against despair, a refusal to accept that the future had been canceled for an entire generation. The moral fabric of society stretched and tore under the unbearable pressure of prolonged starvation. Most people tried desperately to maintain their integrity even as they slowly starved. They shared what little food they had with neighbors who had even less. They cared for the sick and elderly when they could barely care for themselves. They formed communal kitchens where small amounts of food could be pooled and distributed more efficiently. But the siege also revealed the darkness that extreme deprivation could awaken in human beings. Theft of food and ration cards became increasingly common. Ration cards were stolen from the dying and pried from the hands of the dead. Markets emerged where anything could be traded for bread, and desperation drove people to part with treasured possessions, family heirlooms, wedding rings, and irreplaceable keepsakes for a few grams of sustenance. There were crimes far worse than theft. The historical record contains documented evidence of cannibalism during the siege, though the full extent remains difficult to determine with certainty. Soviet authorities prosecuted thousands of cases during and after the blockade. Most cases involved consuming the flesh of those who had already died from starvation or other causes. A smaller and more disturbing number involved murder, committed to obtain human flesh. These crimes represented the absolute extreme of human behavior, the point beyond which civilized conduct broke down entirely. They were not representative of how the vast majority of people behaved, but they stood as a terrible reminder of what prolonged starvation could do to the human mind. The overwhelming majority of Leningraders did not cross this terrible line. They starved with their dignity intact, and hundreds of thousands died that way, having maintained their humanity to the end. Water became almost as precious and difficult to obtain as food. With pipes frozen solid and pumping stations without electrical power, residents had to find water wherever they could. The journey to the river was exhausting for bodies weakened by hunger. Carrying water back home required strength that many people simply did not have remaining. Some collapsed on the way back and froze to death within sight of their own buildings. The dead accumulated far faster than they could be removed or buried. In the first winter of the siege, the deadliest period, bodies piled up in apartments, in building courtyards, and along the streets and sidewalks. Families lacked the physical strength to carry their loved ones to cemeteries. Inside the blockade, people developed strategies for survival that would have seemed utterly unthinkable in normal times. They learned which weeds and wild plants were edible and could provide some nutrition. They scraped wallpaper paste from walls and ate it for its trace amounts of starch and flour. They boiled leather belts, shoes, and book bindings to extract whatever nutrition remained in the animal products used in their manufacture. Joiner's glue and carpenter's glue, made from animal bones and hooves, became valued sources of protein. People learned to detect the early signs of dystrophy in themselves and others, recognizing the distinctive swelling of limbs that signaled the body systems were beginning to fail. They learned that once this swelling began, death was often not. Psychological toll of the siege was immense and lasting. People lost family members one by one over the course of months. They watched close friends weaken steadily and die before their eyes. They experienced survivors' guilt for continuing to live when so many others did not. They lived with constant fear of artillery bombardment, of the relentless cold, of hunger that seemed to have no end. Many people kept personal diaries during the siege, recording their daily experiences in words that still have the power to move readers to tears decades later. These diaries reveal the inner lives of ordinary people under unimaginable pressure, documenting their fears and their hopes, their small daily victories, and their devastating personal losses. Some diarists died before the siege ended, their final entries trailing off into silence. One such diary belonged to a young girl named Tanya Savishava. She was just 11 years old when the siege began. Over the course of several terrible months, she recorded the deaths of her family members in a small notebook, one by one. Her sister Zhenya died in December. Her grandmother followed in January. Her brother Lika died in March. Her uncle Vasya in April. Her uncle Lyosha in May. Her mother also died in May. Her final entry, written in the child's handwriting, read simply and devastatingly, "The Savishevs are dead. Everyone is dead. Only Tanya is left." She was eventually evacuated from the dying city, but never recovered from the physical effects of prolonged starvation and the psychological trauma of what she had witnessed and lost. She died in 1944 at the age of just 14. Her diary, only a few pages long, became one of the most powerful and heartbreaking testimonies to the human cost of the siege. Through 1942 and into 1943, the siege continued its grinding course. Conditions improved slightly as supply routes became somewhat more efficient and as the city's remaining population stabilized at a lower level. But the danger never truly ended. German artillery continued to bombard Leningrad on a regular basis. Air raids killed hundreds of civilians at a time. The front lines remained close enough to the city that the sound of gunfire was a constant background presence in daily life. People learned to live with the ever-present threat of sudden death, taking shelter in basements and metro stations when air raid sirens sounded, emerging to continue their interrupted lives when the all-clear signal came. Those who worked in essential services became the backbone of the city's continued survival. Medical personnel treated the sick and wounded despite lacking even basic supplies and medications. They performed surgeries without anesthesia when supplies ran out, treated serious infections without antibiotics, and watched helplessly as patients died from conditions that would have been easily treatable in peacetime. Firefighters responded to blazes caused by incendiary bombs, often fighting fires without adequate water pressure because the water system had failed. Police officers maintained public order as best they could, tracking down thieves, investigating serious crimes, and trying to prevent the complete breakdown of civil society. Teachers, engineers, tram drivers, factory workers, and countless others kept showing up for work day after day because the alternative was to give in entirely to despair. In January 1943, Soviet forces finally succeeded in opening a narrow land corridor to Leningrad through enemy lines. It was not a full lifting of the siege by any means, but it allowed more supplies to reach the city by rail and reduced the dangerous dependence on the lake crossing. The psychological impact on the population was significant and immediate. After more than 500 days of complete encirclement and isolation, there was finally a physical connection to the rest of the country. Food supplies gradually increased. Death rates continued to fall. The city that had seemed destined to die slowly began to believe it might actually survive. The full lifting of the siege came in January 1944, nearly 900 days after it had begun. Soviet forces pushed German troops back far enough that enemy artillery could no longer reach the city's buildings and streets. The official announcement was met throughout Leningrad with celebration, tears of relief, and stunned disbelief. People who had somehow lived through nearly 3 years of constant bombardment, mass starvation, and incalculable loss emerged into a world where the immediate mortal threat had finally ended. But the city they looked upon was merely a shadow of what it had been before the war. Entire neighborhoods lay in ruins. Historic buildings were damaged or destroyed beyond recognition. The population had been reduced by well over 1 million people. The dead could never be brought back to life. The human cost of the siege remains staggering by any measure. Estimates vary among historians, but most serious scholars believe that between 800,000 and 1 million civilians died during the 900-day blockade, with the vast majority perishing from starvation and diseases directly related to malnutrition. This grim toll makes the siege of Leningrad the deadliest blockade in all of recorded human history, with more civilian deaths than the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined. The scale of suffering endured by the civilian population exceeded almost anything else experienced in modern warfare. The survivors carried their experiences with them for the rest of their lives, a burden that never fully lifted. Many could never bring themselves to speak about what they had witnessed, finding the memories too painful to revisit even decades later. Others felt compelled to testify at war crimes trials, give interviews to historians and journalists, and worked tirelessly to ensure that the siege would never be forgotten by future generations. They established memorials, wrote memoirs, and carefully preserved the diaries and personal artifacts of those who had died. The collective memory of the siege became an essential part of the city's identity, persisting even after the city was renamed St. Petersburg following the dissolution of the Soviet Union. The people of St. Petersburg have never forgotten what their grandparents and great-grandparents endured as Leningraders. For those who lived through it and survived, the siege became the defining experience of their entire lives. Survivors described feeling a profound bond with others who had shared their suffering, a connection that people who had not been there could never fully understand or penetrate. They spoke of the siege with a complex mixture of pride and deep sorrow, proud that they had not broken under the pressure, sorrowful beyond measure for all the people and possibilities that had been lost. Many survivors suffered lasting health effects from prolonged malnutrition, including chronic conditions that plagued them for decades. Some never fully recovered emotionally from the psychological trauma. The siege had taken something essential from them that could never be restored. The city itself eventually rose from its devastation. Leningrad was painstakingly rebuilt in the decades following the war, its damaged palaces and monuments carefully restored to their former glory, its industry revived and modernized, its population eventually growing to exceed pre-war levels. The Hermitage Museum rehung its paintings on restored walls. The Kirov Ballet resumed its world-renowned performances. Universities reopened their doors to new generations of students. Life returned in full measure to streets that had once been silent except for the sounds of artillery and the shuffle of starving feet. But the memory of the siege was built permanently into the fabric of the renewed city present in memorials large and small, in museums dedicated to the blockade, and in the stories that grandparents told the grandchildren who could scarcely imagine what their elders had survived. The people of Leningrad did not choose their fate or seek out their suffering. They did not wake up one morning and decide to become heroes or martyrs for any cause. They were ordinary people living ordinary lives, teachers and factory workers, artists and engineers, mothers and fathers and children. They wanted normal lives filled with normal everyday concerns about work and family and the future. Instead, history placed them inside a dying city and forced them to confront the most fundamental questions of human existence. How do you continue living when survival itself is uncertain? What do you owe to others when you cannot even save yourself? What remains of a human being when everything external has been stripped away? The answers they gave through their actions, rather than through words or philosophy, constitute one of the most profound testimonies to human resilience in modern history. They held on when holding on seemed impossible. They refused to surrender their humanity. They maintained, against overwhelming odds and against all reasonable expectation, the basic structures of human society and civilization. They educated children, healed the sick as best they could, created art, and kept essential factories running. They did all of these things while slowly starving to death, while freezing in apartments without heat, while watching everyone around them weaken and die. And in doing so, they proved something essential about the human spirit that mere statistics and casualty figures can never capture. The siege of Leningrad ended in what might be called victory, if victory can be claimed at such a cost. The city survived when it was meant to be destroyed. The people who remained had outlasted their enemies' calculated plan to annihilate them through starvation and bombardment. It was a victory paid for in suffering beyond any reasonable measure of victory that would be remembered as long as the city stood and as long as anyone anywhere cared to learn what had happened within its frozen walls. The dying city had refused to die, and in that stubborn, heroic refusal, it had written one of the most extraordinary chapters in the entire long story of human endurance and survival. For 900 days, ordinary people lived inside a slowly closing circle of death. They faced impossible choices every single day. They lost everything and everyone they loved. And somehow, against all probability, enough of them survived to tell the story to the world. Their testimony reaches across the decades to us today, not as a monument to war or nationalism, but as a record of what human beings can endure and overcome when there is simply no other choice available. It is a story without conventional heroes, only ordinary people trying with everything they had to survive one more day inside a city where every day might be their last. Their survival was never guaranteed, and their suffering offered no neat redemption. But their story endures as a testament to the fact that even in the darkest and most hopeless circumstances imaginable, the fundamental human will to live can